What happened to Komi-san's art style? I was anime only until I saw this panel getting passed around on Twitter, and I saw people saying that the art of Komi-san, one of the most mainstream rom-coms, loved even by Horikoshi himself, had fallen off. So to find out if that was true, I read the manga from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 482, which is why in this video, I'll be analyzing each of the artistic changes made throughout Komi-san Can't Communicate, and explaining how Komi went from looking like this to looking like this. Be warned that because I'll be looking at the entire manga, there will probably be some pretty major spoilers. That being said, before we can talk about what Komi-san looks like now, we need to look at what it looked like in the beginning. And let me tell you, as an anime-only fan, it was jarring to go from the anime to the early manga, because the anime definitely leans more towards the later style. And I'll explain why I think that is later in the video, but when I started the manga from the beginning, one of the things that was immediately clear to me is that Komi-san does not feel like a romantic manga. At least not in the beginning. It's actually ironic because lately I'll find people saying that they don't like the current story because it's too focused on these week-to-week chapters that focus on the side characters instead of the hot and heavy romance. But if you actually read the manga from the beginning, then you realize that this has always been the foundation for this story. In terms of where it lands on the romantic comedy spectrum, Komi-san feels a lot less like Sign of Affection and a lot more like Nagatoro or Tomo-chan, and the art is very much a part of that feeling. If you look at this page from chapter 1, you can see that it reads a lot like a gag manga. It's got very conventional paneling, it's fairly text heavy, and the highlight is Tadano's reaction face. Something that should feel very familiar if you follow the newer gag manga like Roboco, or some of the classics like Bobobo. As a matter of fact, this straight man bit is fairly common early on. You can see it here when Tadano reacts to Komi writing her name on the board. You can also see a similar page in chapter 16. Here you don't get the straight man routine, but you do get this familiar gag routine where there's the build up to Komi doing something silly, and then we get a big reaction from Tadano. Sort of like the manga version of laugh tracks.
Haha!
So when people say that they don't like the manga anymore because it's just Komi interacting with all of the side characters, it's like, well, duh. That's exactly what this manga has been about for over 400 chapters. Anyone who looks at the pages that we mentioned just now can see that for themselves. And as I'm sure you've noticed by now, this translates over to the early character designs as well. But before I say more on that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. So, the first thing you'll notice is how much rounder the faces look in early Komi-san. For example, if we go back to that first page we looked at, you can see that Tadano is almost unrecognizable. His hair is much softer looking and has almost no points. And his face is just one big circle with no jawline. The only thing separating his face from the top of his head is his hairline. Another thing you'll notice is how side profiles are done early on. If you look at how Tadano is drawn at the top of this page, his nose looks huge compared to the rest of the page. This is something that never really goes away, but you can see it a lot more in the earlier parts of the manga. It's not bad or anything like that, it just feels somewhat inconsistent when the characters usually have these wide-looking faces, and then they turn around and it's just nose. Even with a character like Komi. And on that note, let's talk about how the character designs change over time and figure out how we got to panels like this one. To start, let's look at this panel of Komi from chapter 16. At a quick glance, nothing seems all that different, but like I mentioned before, you'll notice that Komi's face looks rounder and wider than you're used to seeing it. Plus, while she still has her iconic long black hair, you'll notice that it looks somewhat thinner and the bangs look fairly unremarkable. Besides her rounder face, the only thing that really stands out is her eyes, which at this stage are drawn very distinctly. She has big eyes, so you're naturally drawn to them, but they're also drawn very narrowly to give Komi that serious look that always gets her into trouble. But more than anything else, what really stands out is how she has these big black pupils. Granted, you will get some pages where it might be a more emotional scene and they do have some detail, but usually they're just these big solid pupils, which might not seem that strange, but for anyone who's used to reading romance manga, it definitely feels off. For example, if you're cultured like me and you follow Iruma-kun, you know that Ameri loves romance manga, and the character in that manga has very intense eyes. This is also something you see in the other manga I mentioned, Sign of Affection. The main character, Yuki, is usually drawn with these eyes that are full of detail, which incidentally gives you the feeling of very intense emotions. Something that gives you the ick when a perfect stranger does it, but something that feels much more inviting in a romance manga. Which is why Komi's emotionless eyes feel out of place in a rom-com. Another reason why early Komi-san reads a lot more like a comedy rather than a romance. But as the story goes on, it becomes much more romantic. And at the same time, the art style changes along with it. So let's use that picture of Komi from before, and now let's compare it to this picture of Komi from chapter 207, nearly halfway into the story. Komi still has the same long black hair, but there's a couple of differences. Her hair is drawn with a bit more detail. As a matter of fact, now it's drawn in a way where you can actually see through the bangs, making her hair look much softer. And speaking of the bangs, now they look huge. This draws much more of your attention to Komi's hair, and incidentally towards her eyes. It also speaks more to her character because before her eyes weren't that covered up, so she always had that intense look. But with them covered up like this, it hides a lot of her eyes, which illustrates how Komi often has a hard time expressing her emotions. Speaking of the eyes, while they aren't that different here, you can notice that the eyelashes are slightly thicker, and the pupils have a hint of shading to them that adds some well-needed nuance. Finally, while it doesn't stand out right away, a surprisingly big difference is how the rest of Komi's face is drawn, namely that her mouth and nose are almost non-existent. This is something that's a big part of the art later in the manga, but we'll get into why it's so important in a few minutes. For now, I'd like to continue talking about the character designs because, again, this is only about halfway through the manga. And obviously, we need to address the elephant in the room, the panel that started this whole discussion in the first place. So this panel comes from one of the most recent chapters, and to be honest, I really don't think it's that bad. But go on Twitter and you'll see people saying stuff like what went wrong, their art style regressed so badly, expression coming straight from a horror manga, or even the most heartbreaking decline in an art style ever. Mind you, this whole thread was started by someone trying to promote South Park Yaoi, so that kinda gives you an idea of the kind of low-life degenerate we're dealing with here. But I've seen enough people say they don't like the recent art to the point where it's basically unavoidable. Now, if you ask me, there's only one big problem in this specific panel, and that's the fact that Komi has no nose. One problem I've noticed is that there's a lot of eye separation in the recent chapters, especially with Komi. And in this page, it's very in your face. But as someone who's read the Dr. Stone manga and watched the anime well over 50 times, I can tell you it's not the worst I've ever seen. But in this specific page, it wouldn't be nearly as bad if Komi had an actual nose. Like, if you look at this carefully, this big gap goes away as soon as you put a nose in the middle. Other than that, I actually like this page. Komi's big eyes illustrate the overwhelming emotions she's experiencing in this scene. And her mouth does look a bit goofy, to say the least, but certainly not as bad as people make it out to be. All in all, I think this page is fine, just a bit goofy looking. But it does bring up some of the other issues with the recent art. Personally, there's two that stick out to me. First is the chibification of Komi. You get a lot of panels where Komi's face is drawn in a way where her eyes, hair, and mouth are so close that everything just looks squished together. It's definitely not as bad, but at times it can make her look less like an anime character and more like a Bratz doll. Another issue you occasionally run into is the eyes not really being all that expressive. For example, let's use this panel of one of my favorite characters, Rumiko. So here we have another page where it's supposed to be this super emotional reaction face. And at first, it does feel that way. But whereas Komi's eyes in the previous example were full of detail, Rumiko's eyes in this page are like a blank slate. They're big, so it gives you this big wow face. But besides the eyebrows, they aren't drawn any different from how they normally look. To illustrate what I mean, if you take your thumb and just hover it over the mouth, suddenly this image loses a lot of the emotion. So as you can see, this face relies heavily on the mouth. So you do occasionally get these kinds of panels where the eyes are somewhat empty or emotionless. But that actually brings up a point I just mentioned a few minutes ago. So remember how in this example I mentioned how Komi basically has no nose or mouth? Well, where it makes other panels look pretty goofy, here it works perfectly. And the reason for that is because it creates a healthy balance. Because you don't see the nose or mouth, your attention is drawn to Komi's eyes. As a result, the eyes feel relatively more expressive. As I read this manga, I noticed that one of the strengths of the art in later chapters is this trick Oda uses, where he sort of plays with this balance between the eyes and the rest of the face. So for example, in this panel of Komi and Rumiko, they have these really goofy faces. But if you use the trick from before and cover their mouths with your thumb, suddenly they aren't nearly as goofy. On the one hand, it gives you these eyes that aren't all that expressive. But on the other hand, because the mouths and the shapes of the faces are drawn in such a silly way, it creates this balance where the reader is left with the same reaction. You can draw a silly face without having to make the entire face look silly. And the opposite is true as well. In this panel from chapter 226, Komi has this very serious, concerned look. If you do that same trick, but this time cover the eyes, her face is completely blank. This time, instead of relying on the mouth, Oda uses the eyes to carry the entire delivery of Komi's emotions in this scene. So while it does create for some goofier looking faces, this trick that Oda uses makes the characters in the manga much more expressive than they ever looked in the early chapters. The more I got into the later chapters, the more I noticed how much more animated Komi looks. Part of this is an intentional reflection of how Komi opens up more towards the end of the story, but a lot of it is Oda's impressive ability to illustrate emotions with just one part of a character's face. Which is why Komi-san's art has never been bad. One look at the hair, the clothes, the scenery, and you can tell that Oda is an incredibly talented artist. The detail is great, but more importantly, the character expression is amazing. It's what led Komi-san to have some of the most iconic character designs in manga, and it's also why this will always be one of my favorite stories. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you rate the art in Komi-san? How does it compare to other manga? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. And if you'd like to join me for another discussion like this one, then make sure to check out my live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday. In those live streams, I react to new chapters of manga as well as share my thoughts on other anime and manga topics. Also, make sure to check out my list of other art and manga videos, which you can find linked right here. But for now, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.